I am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. My mission is to end violence against children. Through my work and this podcast, I help parents break generational cycles of trauma, reconnect with their authentic selves, and raise emotionally healthy children. Together, we have built a global community of conscious parents who want something different for the next generation. Join us as we create a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, how to heal a dysregulated nervous system. If you spend any time on social media, chances are you've come across nervous system regulation content. And if you listened to last week's episode titled Why Self-Help Becomes Harmful, Why You Should Stop Trying to Heal All Your Trauma, then you know I went on a bit of a rant about this whole self-development movement, the wellness culture, the nervous system, young gurus online, and all of that. And today we have another episode about the nervous system. I'm speaking with Jessica Maguire. She is a physiotherapist and the author of The Nervous System Reset: Heal Trauma, Resolve Chronic Pain, and Regulate Your Emotions with the Power of the Vagus Nerve. Together, we unpack what the nervous system actually is, what the vagus nerve does, and why things like heart rate variability matter more than we might realize. We also talk about the different states of the nervous system, how to map your own current state, how to get unstuck, and all of that good stuff. You've probably heard that the fastest way to regulate the nervous system is through breathing, but what Jessica shared with me was quite surprising. I start by asking her about polyvagal theory, which has been in the news lately. Many articles have been written about it, questioning the validity of the theory. If you search polyvagal theory, you'll come across articles like, "Polyvagal theory is dead, now what?" Or "Polyvagal theory is under fire," or "Why the polyvagal theory is untenable," and so on and so forth. We've been talking about the nervous system on this podcast since the beginning of the show. If you want to check out some of the other episodes on the topic, here are a few episodes from our archive. How to recover from burnout by regulating your emotions and nervous system. Befriending your nervous system with Deb Dana. How to regulate your nervous system. How trauma gets stuck in your nervous system. Mind-body tools to develop stress resilience, and the secret language of the body. I'll link those in the show notes if you want to go deeper. If you're new to the podcast, I encourage you to download my Trauma Kit, which is a curated playlist to help you understand how trauma impacts your body, brain, nervous system, and relationships, and what supports real healing. It includes 10 hand-picked conversations with experts like Dr. Gabor Mate, Deb Dana, Dr. Paul Conti, Dr. Dick Schwartz, and many others. It's free, and you can download it and start listening today at authenticparenting.com/traumakit. TRAUMAKIT. And now, please enjoy, and thank you for listening. Why don't you then give us a little bit of overview about the nervous system?
We are hearing a lot about the nervous system, which is great that it's entering the mainstream, but it can be confusing because there's a lot of different messages that we hear about what it is, that we just need to regulate our nervous system as though, does that mean calming down? Maybe for some people. But for others, it can also mean that it would be very helpful for them to mobilize if they are in a burnout stage or they tend to move into freeze. So When we're talking about the nervous system, in terms of regulation, we are talking about the autonomic nervous system. And technically, this has been said to be in our periphery. So we can say that the brain and the spinal cord are thought of as the central nervous system, and that's in the center of the body. So that's an easy way to remember. But maybe the way that we have separated the autonomic nervous system from the central nervous system isn't always helpful, because we can see there is no separation when we look at things like the vagus nerve or the gut-brain axis or the way that our immune and endocrine system work, when we can't separate them. But the autonomic nervous system is made up of the sympathetic nervous system. So if you were to place your hand where your neck meets your body, one hand there, and then the other hand at your waist, and come towards your spine, the sympathetic nervous system is stretching outwards from the spine through there. It's got really, like the nerves of this part of our body that exit the spine have really long axons or tails. So we have big effects throughout the body. You know, we see when we might feel ourselves have a challenge or a threat, there's a mobilization of our energy. So this is a good thing. We want to mobilize energy. And stress isn't actually bad for us as long as we get to recover from it. So the recovery process then happens via the vagus nerve, which runs from the brainstem. So if you run your hand down the back of your head to the base of your skull, and you place one hand over your heart, we can say that is the ventral branch of the vagus nerve. And its connection from the brainstem to our heart is slowing our heart rate down. It's making our breath become full again. And that is in essentially bringing our emotions to regulate as well. And then the other branch of the vagus nerve goes from, again, the brainstem down underneath our diaphragm. And so if you place your other hand on your lower belly, that's where that branch runs. So that branch, the dorsal vagal branch, is going under the diaphragm and spreading out like a vine to touch almost every organ. What's really interesting is we know that 80% of its fibers are running upwards to the brain, sending messages. So the sympathetic nervous system giving mobilization is a little bit like putting the accelerator or the gas down in the car. And then the branch of the vagus nerve running to our heart is acting like a brake, as though if we put the brake on with our foot, we can slow and adjust and make nuanced choices and flexibility in our nervous system. And then the other branch going down to our gut is a little bit like if we pulled on the handbrake to slow down. And that brings immobilization. So we may feel ourselves freeze, energy drops, we might feel our body slump. And then alongside that can be thoughts and stories that, we're helpless, we're hopeless, and we should give up. So those parts give rise to 3 states. We've got mobilization, we've got regulation, and we've got immobilization.
Okay, so this is good. Thank you. So how can someone know if their nervous system is dysregulated? And what do we mean? We find ourselves in those 2 places, other places, right? Not the regulated. So first of all, maybe let's say, how does regulated feel like? What does it mean to be regulated? Not necessarily calm, right? But what does it mean to be regulated? If someone is listening, they're questioning, like, am I regulated? Do I need to regulate my nervous system? How do I know?
It's a good question. I think we might sometimes get confused that if we ever move out of regulation, that this is a bad thing. And it's really not. It's very healthy for our nervous system to mobilize. And in face of really threat that we can't deal with, it's actually healthy for us to immobilize as well. So, after an event, we might see that stress response finishes, and then we are back to our starting baseline. But for people who experience dysregulation, we are seeing this as a shift away from that recovery line, and they can be dysregulated towards mobilization or dysregulated towards immobilization. So for people who experience dysregulation towards mobilization, it's a little bit like the on button is jammed. So there's urgency, hurrying, anxiety, anger, reactivity. And then it can show up in our health or in our physical health as well, with things like gut issues. We see people might have trouble getting to sleep, falling asleep. Their immune system might be more active in the short term, but then over a few days or weeks, there can be a crash and then people can get sick. We also see it in relationships, which is interesting, where we might notice ourselves being more critical, storming off, reacting. So those are all clues. Now, we're not talking that we get reactive in one day. This is really looking that we are spending most of our time in that mobilized state, and it's difficult to get that recovery and come back to regulation. So if we're dysregulated for immobilization, that can feel like an exhaustion even after a full night's sleep. And it's not just being tired, like there's an impending sense of doom that's going along with that feeling of depression and a hopelessness, like things will never get better. I'm always going to be, stuck in this state, or I'll never get the love that I want. And then from a physical health point of view, we might see a brain fog, we might see a loss of libido. The immune system as well struggles here, but also it can become over responsive. Not necessarily the arguing online, but people might withdraw and pull away from others. So all very much running where they can't come back to regulation, which regulation is really where we still have the ups and downs in our energy, but overall, we can still make decisions in line with our deepest values. We're able to be reasonably flexible, adaptable. Our energy is fairly stable, even though we have, again, I might have nervousness. I might get irritated. It's not that we have no emotions, but it's that we're not at the extreme where we lose control.
Okay, good. Thank you for clarifying. So people who are in burnout, they need to slowly, what do they need to do? Rather than answering myself, I should ask you, because a lot of people are in burnout, a lot of parents. There is, staggering statistics, like 48% of parents are unable to function on a day-to-day basis. 41% of today's parents, out of 63 million parents in the United States, are in burnout. And that's not a good place to be, right? So what do people need to do to move from this burnout state into a more regulated state? With that said, I want to say that I often see on social media this message, and maybe that's my own bias, that nervous system regulation means calming yourself, calm yourself. I don't see the other, like you need to mobilize and awaken your system and energize your system message. Is this my own bias, first of all, or that's what you see in social media?
Social media is such a funny place, isn't it? Burnout's a great way to understand our nervous system. It helps us to see dysregulation in the state. So I really can, relate to the relentlessness of parenting, where you might work all day, and I have a 2-year-old daughter, and then you're still working as soon as you get home, and there's a big mental load, and there's lots of things to remember and do. So I think what's been really helpful for me is changing my expectations around the amount of time I'm going to get to spend on my nervous system. Now, we don't need to go to a spa or get an hour-long massage or, to have our nervous system healthy. And I think, like, for me, that's just not realistic. I need things that I can do in short pockets of time. But I also now have a non-negotiable in my weekly schedule of a 1 hour hike one morning on the weekend, like totally interrupted, all by myself, no phone. And my husband and I allow each other to have one morning where we're doing a little bit. So that's been really helpful. And that's enough for me to know that I get to recover in that time. But it's interesting with burnout because even in my time before having children, when I was quite young, I experienced burnout. And this came about from owning a clinic where I was sometimes seeing up to 18 patients a day, managing a team and running the business. So what I was doing, and this is where I see it starts, is we override our neurobiological limits day after day after day. And whether that's because it's a lack of knowing what they are, or there's something else underneath that drives that. So for me, I was an overachiever. And maybe underneath that, I felt like I had to prove something to be worthy. So often these things can be driving that overriding, not listening when we're fatigued, not listening to our nervous system signals. I didn't know about, how to connect with these different states in such a way that brought awareness of what I needed to do. But that, in essence, is what self-regulation is. It's listening to our inner voice and then knowing what choices to make to bring our physiology and our emotions into regulation. Now, to come back to burnout, I love to use the analogy of a bath. So let's say you wanted to have a bath one night and you wanted this really nice warm water. So you turn on the hot tap and then you turn on a little bit of the cold. But let's say somebody has taken a really hot shower before you and the hot water runs out. This used to happen when I grew up a lot. So you'd be left with just the cold water. Well, burnout's a little bit the same. We don't start with burnout. We start with overriding our limits for weeks and months before that. And we have too much hot water running. So we live in mobilization for a long time before we hit immobilization and burnout. So part of what we do is not ask people who are in burnout and already too immobilized. We don't say to them, calm down. A large part of this is to actually bring in mobilizing energy. So that might be coming through play, like doing the activities we love that energize us, sometimes with other people, sometimes on our own. But I think a big part of this, and this is what really probably flies in the face of what we see on social media, I think a lot of people actually who are in burnout would benefit from learning how to tolerate fight energy so that when they get annoyed, when maybe they're being pushed too far or the expectations on them are too far, they don't internalize and shut down and suppress, but they learn to speak up for themselves, because then they can maybe delegate. They can say, this is all I'm doing, or you need to take care of that. So I think there's a big piece around nervous system regulation that is so much more than calming down.
Yeah, I see that. I like that example that you take a hike for an hour, the solo hike, and it's enough for you. I love that word, enough, because oftentimes I think people in this maximalist, consumerist culture, also they think that they need like a whole morning routine that is 3 hours long, evening routine, exercise routine, right? Or all sorts of things. And you have to have a toolkit for your mindfulness or nervous system regulation. So what I love about is that it's a simple tool. You go for a walk for 1 hour and you know that it's enough for you. That's the key part here. Because I feel like people hear this kind of information, they throw themselves at everything, which can be its own stressor, right? Trying different things and not knowing what you need, what works for you, how much do you need? And I just want to emphasize that part, that it's not about doing many things or accumulating too many tools. It's knowing what works for you for that given time in your life. Maybe when you were running that clinic and you were seeing 18 clients per day, 1 hour of weekly walk would not have been enough, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
probably needed daily things and weekly things. So that's just commentary on that. You said, emotions and physiology, and this is a really interesting doorway. Yes, when we get activated or mobilized or there's a stress, there are usually emotions involved, right? Let's say you're angry, you're frustrated, you are irritated, or how do we regulate? Do we regulate the physiology first, or do we deal with emotions first? Or this is a wrong question to ask. We want to do both at the same time, and it's a seamless, fluid process. So, if this is worth discussing, let's discuss. If not, maybe we can move forward.
I think it's a great question. If we understand how our sensory systems work and we understand the basis of emotions, we can't really separate the two. So this relates to the eighth sensory system called interoception. And this is how we recognize our internal bodily signals. We've got our 5 outer-facing senses, and then we've got things like proprioception, where our joints are in space, and our vestibular system. So that is to do with balance and spatial awareness. But interoception is very, very fascinating. And I spoke before about the vagus nerve sending 80% of its signals up to the brain. So this can be things like butterflies in our stomach, it can be the beats of our heart, but it's also sending a lot of information that we're not aware of. So it could be changes in blood pressure. It could be our food digesting. And that's really good, because if we were talking, Anna, and you were feeling every single thing that you'd eaten for lunch, it would be very distracting from our conversation, right? Because you would be aware of all of this information. So it's not until this sensory information reaches a higher part in our brain called the insula do we become aware of sensations. Now, a lot of information is just coming up to the lower centers of our brain, and then our brain is adjusting what's happening in our body. That's self-regulation, right? There's a regulation and a homeostasis and a balance. So when signals reach our insula, it's usually 2 or more bodily signals that will make up where we become aware of something. So let's say, on a really basic example to do with physiology, we could say, well, my throat's dry and I feel a bit lightheaded. Okay, I'm dehydrated. So the action is, let's go and get a drink. And then again, self-regulation. But there's not one in our brain where emotions are made. It is this foundation of bodily signals. And then it's also the way that the networks in our brain light up. So it could be that we appraise a certain signal in a certain way, like this shouldn't be happening. And that can drive more, signals. We might feel pain in our belly and think, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have eaten that. Oh no, something really bad's going to happen. And that drives more of a threat response. So we'll have a different change in our physiology and our emotions. But the foundation for our emotions are these bodily signals. And being able to recognize them and read them clearly is very much linked with both our physical health and our mental health. I think there's a lot we can do from a physiological perspective that takes care of what happens with our emotions. So if you think about someone who misses cues of hunger and then they get hangry because of shifts in blood glucose levels, because of, feeling irritated because of not having enough glucose. So, we can't really separate that. And this is where the hallmarks of sleep, if we can exercise, if we can eat well, will support our emotional well-being so much. Really interesting question, though.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about that as I was walking today before the interview. I was experiencing like a mixture of different emotions, and I'm like, wait, do I listen to my feelings right now and sort through all this like jumbled, like, like a yarn, like all connected together? Or do I just like breathe and regulate myself? And what do I do? I was walking just like literally 30 minutes before this interview. And what I did was I took my shoes off. I just stepped on the grass, which is green, it's spring. And I started breathing and looking at the green trees, listening to the birds and things like that. I'm like, wow, that jumble that was inside my brain or inside my body, that emotional, it just disappeared. So, like, I didn't need to sort through those feelings per se. They were not strong, they were in the background and they were like all mixed. No one strong note was coming through, right? And so I was able to manage my physiology and it all just disappeared. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. But then I started thinking, sometimes the emotion is very strong. And like I want to follow that sadness or the grief or the anger. And I was thinking, maybe when the emotion is strong or more pronounced, one emotion, it's good to like observe the emotion, be with the feeling, feel the feeling, and then you'll gain regulation. And whereas when it's all this mixed and you can't like parse through what is it that you're feeling, sometimes you have all those things together. And I don't know, I made a mental note that, you know what, at the end, it doesn't matter. As long as you regulate and get a handle on yourself, that's what matters. But it was just an interesting thing that happened before this interview. So I wanted to ask that. And thank you for explaining. So, heart rate variability and vagal tone. These are important things, right? So I want you to explain what they are and what they can tell us about our own states.
Yeah, for sure. So we can see from the branch of the vagus nerve that's running from the brainstem down to the heart that it's connecting to our sinoatrial node, which is the heart's pacemaker. And so the heart doesn't necessarily beat like a metronome, like
Mm-hmm.
it is. So when we breathe in, it speeds up. And then when we breathe out, it slows down. So what we know is that when we breathe in, the vagus nerve relaxes a little bit. And then when we breathe out, it re-engages. And so that variability is telling us what the vagus nerve's doing and if it's working well. And we can see that there's good evidence to show the link between the variation in our heart and the association with some chronic illnesses. That's been shown through many different pieces of the research, but we are definitely seeing things like irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, fibromyalgia, and other chronic pain conditions are linked with a lower variability. So
Mm.
there's a few ways that we could understand this. It doesn't mean that we can say because this is happening, but some thoughts around that can be when we have high heart rate variability and our vagus nerve is working well, we're likely to spend more time in regulation. So, inside that state of regulation, what we will be experiencing is that our immune system is working well. So, we know the link of the neuroimmune system and how that impacts all of those things that I spoke about. We can say that in regulation, our endocrine system is functioning as it should. So we see that link between regulation and physical health as well. The vagus nerve, in addition to the things we've already said it does play a role in inflammation, but also pain processing. So it's more of an ecosystem. It's kind of spoken about like something we can hack, but we can't. And it's not necessarily about saying, well, I just need a healthier vagus nerve. It's more about the balance between the whole way the nervous system responds. And a lot of that is through prediction from our past. And so we can train our nervous system in the same way that we train to go to the gym if we know that we tend to predict threat and things that keep us out of that state of regulation.
So we want higher HRT? What are the numbers? Are there specific numbers for optimal health, or how do we measure? People have all these wearable devices these days, right? That tells them their HRT. What can you say about that? Like, what's a good number? Like, I never measure mine. So how do
Yeah.
I know if
So
mine is good?
heart rate variability isn't
Mhm.
something we have one number for. It will
Mhm.
vary based on your sex. It'll vary on your age. So it's more population controlled. Like you would look at what the mean scores would be for your age
Mhm.
and
Mm.
also your sex. And then there's even variation in fitness that will impact it as well.
Mm.
With women, it's interesting. So women tend to have a higher heart rate variability than men until they hit perimenopause. And then we see that changes. And that's because of the hormonal shifts that we see
Mm.
impacting the nervous system. So to track it, there are a lot of variables, but
You use a wearable device?
no, because a lot of them have artifacts. I used to, in my first degree, measure the heart through electrocardiographs. So I was hooking up the little electrodes and watching people's hearts. But now I would measure it more through controlled environments. And I think it's better to look at over a longer period to watch how somebody progresses. But day-to-day fluctuations are normal. And I don't believe that the devices that are used for home use are as accurate as they could be, and then that can throw people off. I would rather help people get better at recognizing their interoceptive signals and know the states of what's happening for themselves.
Yeah. Okay, good. You led me to my question. That's what I want to talk to you about. So, in your book, you describe in layman terms the too hot, too cold, just right states and how we can recognize what state we are currently in and how to move through those states. And sometimes people get stuck in one state. So, what's a good direction to go with all those states? The book illustrates like wonderfully. It has lots of exercises one can take. Obviously, we don't have enough time to go through all the exercises, but what would be beneficial for the listener in terms of something practical they can take away from checking their states?
Yeah, sure. So we have touched on this a little bit with the car. We said the mobilization and then
Mm-hmm.
mobilization, then the brake. So it's another analogy of that. So, when we're mobilized, that's like it's too hot. And so what we would recognize in that state is the sensations of our body. So we might notice even our posture shift in a way where the jaw tightens, our shoulders tighten. We might notice heat in our chest. Sometimes our hands, clench up or they get a bit sweaty. And we might notice this bracing through our body. And people often don't even notice that that's happening. Like they come back to check when they're stressed, it's just holding themselves. And then they check in and they're like, oh, okay, a little bit tense here. And then the emotions that come with that, we can see a bit of a range. So we can have more of a fight response of irritation and anger. Or we might go the opposite way and it could be a bit of a flight response or anxiety, hurrying, urgency. And then the stories around that are going to be more, I've got to hurry, I don't have enough time. So, really, what we're looking to do is to, first of all, if we can shift the body to support regulation, which is what you were saying before, Anna, like it's a lot about going, not getting lost in the context of what the story might be, because often the story is following along from what state you're in. It's more looking at, okay, I recognize this is my nervous system mobilizing energy. Sometimes that is really intentionally being able to slow ourselves down rather than multitasking and trying to do as many things. It's about doing things a little bit slower. And then, for a lot of people, they find that they can shift back towards more regulation by allowing themselves to move and discharge some of that mobilized energy. So it's really interesting with cortisol that it gets such a bad rap, but cortisol is not good or bad. It's just a hormone. But what it's doing is releasing, like mobilizing glucose for us to take action. Now, because we're sitting so often and we have this mobilized glucose, we just feel antsy. So getting up to move and getting our heart rate up for 10 or 15 minutes can often be enough to then, okay, now I can sit back down and settle. So that, I think that's a really, really big part for mobilization. And then for immobilization, we might notice, and we kind of spoke about this, right? We might notice more of that collapse, the helplessness. This is never going to work out. And so a lot of the time, there'll be a withdrawal and an isolation in that state. And so part of what can bring us back is really connecting with others, putting ourselves in places where people are not at home, isolated and alone. And then, we said like allowing that mobilizing energy to come in, like fight for some people, play for others, adding some movement in that's gentle, not that we're going to go and run 10Ks if we feel shut down and flat, but it's shifting the physiology, shifting the energy of and the way we're holding our body to tell the brain come back towards regulation.
Yeah, so let's sort of summarize this part a little bit. So we are tracking sensations, we're tracking emotions, we're tracking body posture, we're tracking energy,
Thoughts and stories.
thoughts and stories. And you have a wonderful exercise, Can you describe this exercise about the window of tolerance? Like you draw lines on a piece of paper, you write too cold, too hot. Maybe people can do this. This would be a good one to track their states based on what we said.
Yeah, so you can do this by making a window in the middle, that's regulation, and then you'd have a line above that and below that. And above that window is the mobilization, or we can say too hot, or we can say the accelerator. We've given four different to look at it. Or below that, we can say is too cold, it's the handbrake is on, or we're stuck. And you can actually use this as an exercise to bring to mind a time where maybe you have noticed yourself shift into that state, and then recognize the sensations, the emotions, the postures. You might recognize the thoughts that I said that go along with each of those as well. It is a practical way that you can get to know that. But, in time, the idea is that you can notice this in your day to day. So there's not this like, oh, I get to the end of the day and take care of my nervous system. It really just becomes a part of how we live. And then in the moment, we can catch what's happening with our energy and our states, and we can redirect that in the moment throughout the day. And that's a much more powerful way to support our energy and our emotions and our physiology.
Yeah, agree. What are some powerful tools besides breathing? Well, let's talk about breathing. I think that's sort of like the fastest way you can influence your nervous system, correct?
It really depends. I think breathing is one that can be great.
Mm-hmm.
So for overbreathers, so what we can see in anxiety is people shorten their breath and they tend to breathe too much.
Mm-hmm.
So it can look like, yes, I'm okay. I'm just having a very hard time. Now, if we say to people, breathe, 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 they can actually end up overbreathing more. And that can further drive dysregulation. And then for people who tend to be too flat, they tend to underbreathe. So they now, if we tell them just take a long, slow, deep exhalation, they're already breathing slow and we're
yeah.
So, I don't start with breathing ever. I teach much, much further down the road. Once people understand, where it fits. And I think this is the piece of my work that I love the most, which is the trauma sensitive sequencing framework, which is really about how instead of throwing, techniques at the wall and hoping something sticks, we work the neurobiological hierarchy of the nervous system. And a lot of the time, the best thing we can do is understand how our body's meeting the environment in the ways that I was saying at the start. So this is looking at the way that we might hold ourselves, or the way that we can notice the way we're connecting with our environment. And that, through sensations or through the vision. We know that people who are more anxious, looking for threats, they're scanning, they're hypervigilant. So we can work with the eyes and vision in different ways. We can work with sound. But I think breathing is probably being oversimplified, where what I'm seeing with a lot of people with anxiety is there's sometimes a breathing pattern disorder that needs retraining so that they don't tend to breathe like this every time there's an anxious, because you can't get somebody calm who is breathing that way habitually. And I think it just needs a little bit more nuance, like most things with the nervous system.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's individual in some ways, but how do you start your work? If we're not starting with breathing, what is another entryway?
So I always start with connecting with the sensory systems. And as you said, it will depend on the person. So the work is state specific and it's sensory specific. So some people, sensations to them are too loud, are too big, and it's like the music's turned right up. Yeah, for some other people, it's like the sensations are too quiet and they're turned down, and there's more of a depression or dissociation. So the way that we get people to connect with senses is going to be different depending on that piece. So visually, if we're going to use vision, this is an oversimplification because I teach this normally in a 2-hour lecture of how this works, but we are wanting to train the attention networks in the brain and to help people come into a place where they are able to look towards neutral stimuli or look towards a part of their environment where it is pleasant. And, that can take some work. We think that we've got that all as a voluntary piece, but that's in hypervigilance, that's not the case. So people that are very anxious are often scanning for threats and interpreting that visual information as a threat, even though it may not be that way. And the auditory system can also be very, very helpful for this too, albeit we would meet that to what the person is actually doing. So I take quite a clinical approach to it because, we are essentially retraining people's way that their brain and body are interpreting signals.
Interesting. How about the body and the posture of the body?
Yeah. So we spoke about how we could notice the jaw clench, the bracing, the tension for mobilization. And then we notice for people, there's a reflexive slumping or collapse that can come. And I think the biggest part is noticing that happen and then how it drives behavior. So for instance, if somebody is in a work setting and they confronted and they immediately slump, then it belongs to what we call the procedural memory system, where we've got a learnt way or pattern of responding. So what we want to do is learn to come back to, okay, I just noticed my body slump reflexively, and this might come back to a time early in our lives where we were criticized or put down, and we start giving the brain a new experience from the body, which is actually, I'm going to add some energy here. I'm going to sit tall. I'm going to press my feet into the ground. And I'm going to open up my chest. Now, for somebody whose energy tends to drop, we might even get them to think about pushing your feet down into the ground and contracting through some of these muscles so that the signals coming to their brain are louder. And then you will notice that they are actually still able to connect and use their voice, because the language centers in the brain they still have access to. So, that's a way that we can use the body to do something very, very sophisticated.
I see. Let's see. I have so many notes here. Secondary states, you write about that. Let's talk about secondary states. How do we engage in them?
We've already been speaking about them with play. So play is a blend between the mobilizing energy, but we keep it in check with ventral vagal energy, or the regulating energy of our nervous system. So that can be the state that people move into for peak performance. So if you think about if you needed to get up and give a talk, and you
Mhm.
were nervous, that would be the mobilizing energy. Now, people think, well, I've got to get rid of this nervousness. I'm stressed. This is bad. Actually, not. That's a really healthy thing. It helps us perform at our best. But we can think about play in many ways, but it's more thinking of what excites you, what brings you mobilization, what are you passionate about, but you're not moving into anxiety. For some people, it's like, well, it's a stretch for me to get up on stage and speak. Well, yes. And it's a good way to learn to tolerate the sensations of mobilization, particularly if we tend to experience anxiety. That's a way that we can learn to get better at bringing in or strengthening that part of the vagus nerve that slows us down. And often it works really well when we use play with other people who are regulated because of
Mm.
co-regulation that will shift us back towards regulation.
What can you say about a parent who, as a parent yourself, parenting can be challenging. Our children often are dysregulated, and we need to be in a regulated state so that they can gain co-regulation, which is hard to do. But oftentimes parents, let's say, are reactive and they are escalating. What could be done in that moment for the parent who is getting more agitated and more reactive and they're shouting and threatening and that kind of stuff? Like that's a mobilization state, right? So what would be a good intervention for that parent?
Yeah, I think the best thing is to change the environment, to see that if you're at home and your child might be, having a lot of energy themselves and you're getting more and more mobilized, where it's getting to the point where you're like, I'm going to flip my lid here. You either need to remove yourself from that environment, or you and your child, like by, going into the other room, or you and your child change that environment. So I think back to my daughter where I'll start to notice, she's it's not necessarily boredom, but, there's a point where she might need to run. She might need to let some energy out and have some play. So that's where, and we live close to a playground, which is wonderful, we can take that. But even for myself, when I get home from work, if I've been inside all day and looking at a screen a lot of the day, I need to get out into nature, be away from screens, not the artificial light. So it's like the sunlight, the trees, the space, and the movement. So I think we probably underestimate those pieces in the environment for what is being created. And then kids are so funny. They really a mirror to what's happening. And it's hard. Parenting can be really challenging, especially when we've worked all day and then, we're coming home to more things to take care of if our job is demanding. So I think there's a process of, it's not again about the 1 hour regulation practice because it's just probably not realistic, but it's probably looking at the simple things that we can do in the moment. So for instance, if we're starting to prepare dinner or we're starting to, get our kids ready for things and we start to feel that tension escalating, it might be as simple as, oh gosh, my shoulders are up. All right, I need to add some movement in my body, circle my neck. And we can turn this into play with our kids, right? Like I think my daughter and her love of dance and movement, as a lot of kids do, that allows for that piece of bringing that in, and the playfulness with her is a way that I bring myself back to regulation. Now, it's not always perfect, but I think we've got to also sometimes check our expectations that it's really about good enough parenting, and we're just not going to be regulated all of the time.
Yeah, thank you for that. Final parting words. What do you have for us about the nervous system reset or regulation that I didn't ask? Perhaps there is something you want to share, or what do you want people to remember from this conversation, perhaps?
I think given your audience is mostly parents, sometimes it's more about our state than what we say. So, my daughter's 2 and language doesn't get you so far at this age. It's more about the hugging, the contact, my voice, the messages that are not necessarily about language. But even as children start to get a little bit older, I think we have a big emphasis on saying the right thing that can make us a little bit worked up. And I would say sometimes if you're naturally in the state towards regulation, you'll say the right thing anyway. So try not to get too hung up on, saying the perfect words and coming back to a state of regulation, because they will feel that the most. Like, co-regulation is the most powerful bottom-up resource or body-up resource that we can give to somebody else. And that beautiful regulated presence, to me, that is the essence of love. So, don't get too hung up on the top down and the talking. It's often just the state you're in that has the biggest impact.
Oh, brilliant advice. I love that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time with us. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Anna. That was lovely.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you found this episode helpful and inspiring. Be sure to hit that follow button so you don't miss future episodes, and take a moment to leave a rating and review. It really helps others find the show. I would love to hear your thoughts and takeaways. Join the conversation in the Authentic Parenting Facebook group or visit the contact page at authenticparenting.com/contact to get in touch. Authentic Parenting is an ad-free show, and your donations is what makes this podcast possible. Support the show by visiting authenticparenting.com/support or becoming a patron at patreon.com. Your contributions make it possible for me to continue bringing you weekly episodes. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening. This episode was edited and produced by Aminur. If you need expert support to bring your dream podcast to life, from editing to full production, Aminur can help make it happen. You'll find his link in the show notes.